the closer I can get to capturing actual reality, the more immersive I can make my content. At least that's what I tell my wife every time I want to buy a new camera. Hasn't worked yet. Look, I've made a ton of videos for budget equipment because I believe the top priority of a new streamer should be their branding, not fancy equipment. But what happens when you're ready for a big boy camera? Where do you turn? I mean, people have to feel like they can come here for advice. I mean, I've made a million videos on how to get the most out of your cheap, tiny webcams, and then people tune into my stream and they see that I'm streaming with two massive full-frame DSLRs. It is what it is. So let's talk about this. My name is Harris Heller. I am your stream doctor, and today we're gonna take this video here and I'm gonna see how quickly and simply I can explain, one, what the bare bones equipment needed to stream with an actual camera are, two, the necessary functions that a camera needs to have in order to work as a stream camera, because not all DSLRs, not all fancy cameras can work as a stream camera, and three, the basic attributes that you should look for when picking a camera and a lens to get that look that you really want on your stream. Do you want something super wide? Do you want something a little narrower, maybe a blurry background? You ready for this? Let's jump into it. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the equipment that you will absolutely need to pull this off. You cannot use a camera without this stuff. Nobody likes to be in that situation where their Amazon order comes in, they get all their equipment, they set it up, they're ready for the stream, and they're missing one thing, and they have to pull it all apart and wait another 2 days to a week for that one cable they're missing. Nobody wants to be that guy. So let's list them. Number one, a camera. Duh. Number two, a lens. Most cameras come with a stock lens. We'll talk more about lenses later. Number three, you'll need some kind of power supply. The last thing you want to do is be running off a battery. Batteries only last like a couple hours, and you don't want to be charging and swapping out batteries throughout your stream and your camera shuts down in the middle of a stream. You need to get a power supply. These are also called AC adapters. Links to any of this equipment that I'm mentioning down in the description below. Important note, I highly recommend spending a little extra cash on this and getting the actual brand name power supply. You can get cheap knockoff AC adapters for like literally a fifth of the cost. It's tempting, I know, but there's a reason they're so cheap. Don't fall for it, your camera will thank you later. Number four, you'll need some kind of capture card. Now, any kind of capture card will do. For example, we've got a pretty standard capture card here, but most capture cards not only have an HDMI in, see if we can get that to focus. Come on, meow. Like this for capturing your footage, but they also have an HDMI out, so when you're capturing your PlayStation, you can then go back out to your monitor and you can actually see what you're playing. But because you're using a camera, you don't need to monitor your image on another screen. You can actually get some slimlined down capture cards. For example, you can go the more cost-efficient route and get something like the Elgato Camlink, which is just basically a USB stick with an HDMI input on it. It costs like $130 rather than the $170 to $200 full-blown capture cards. So probably a good option. I'll link it down below, but it's usually out of stock on Amazon, so you'll either have to check back or grab it somewhere else. You'll need an HDMI cable going from your camera to said capture card. Now, your camera probably has one of two HDMI outputs on it, either micro HDMI or mini HDMI. Figure out which kind of port your camera has and get the cable that has that HDMI on one end and a regular HDMI on the other end to go into your capture card. Lastly, you'll need a tripod. Nothing fancy, I have like a $30 one from Best Buy, but these kind of cameras don't mount to the top of your monitor like a webcam does. You'll need something to keep this sucker in the air. Some cameras or lenses come in packages with tripods, so keep an eye out for those. Great, now that you know everything you need, let's talk about what kind of camera you need to pick up, because some cameras, they don't work for streaming, and let me tell you why. There are two basic functions your camera has to be capable of, and a lot of cameras, they just aren't. Keep in mind, these cameras, they weren't designed to be stream cameras. They were designed to be photography or videography cameras, and we're kind of finagling them for our own use. So function number one that your camera needs, it needs to be able to run indefinitely. Most cameras shut off after 30 minutes max. See how this says auto power off? And if I click on this, I can go down to off. That means this camera can run indefinitely. Not all cameras can do that. And the hard thing about this is, this isn't like a massive feature for videographers and photographers. They don't really care that much about this, so this function isn't usually broadcast front and center. You have to do some digging on the camera to make sure that it can actually do this. Function number two, the HDMI port on your camera needs to output a clean signal. There are a lot of cameras that output a low-res, compressed, letterboxed image. That's actually the problem with this camera, and it's why I don't stream with it. You didn't pay for that. You paid for a nice image, you should get a nice image. Now, like I said, these two things aren't advertised usually on like the front Amazon page of a camera. You have to do a little bit of digging, but if you want an easy answer for cameras that you can use, Elgato has a website. Again, I'll link to it below. This is not an Elgato ad, by the way. They just happen to have a lot of information on this stuff. They have a web page called Camera Check where they'll let you know a handful of cameras that will actually work and a handful of cameras that won't work. So if you're looking for a good camera for streaming, make sure you check that Elgato link below. Cool? Also, at the end of this video, I'll suggest a couple cameras for you. All right, let's talk about the fun part now. Let's talk about the look of your camera and how you choose a camera and a lens, what you need and what you don't need. And if I can do this under 4 minutes, then it means I'm a genius and you should subscribe to the YouTube channel. See what I did there? That was tricky, huh? You should also, by the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, hit that like button. Make sure you come and follow me on Twitch. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, Friday evening, and sometimes Saturday mornings. Link to everything in the description below. I stream using really fancy cameras, so if you want to see what that looks like, you know. All right, let's talk about your camera's look. Now, there are two basic attributes that you need to decide about your look. One is how far the camera is zoomed in. Are you getting something super wide? Or are you getting something super narrow? This is called your field of view. Both can look beautiful. I actually have both a super wide and a really narrow look on my stream. The other question is, how blurry do you want your background to look? Now, this is called the depth of field. So you got your field of view and you got your depth of field, right? You got to figure out what you want. Let's talk about field of view first. Lenses have something called a focal length, right? It's kind of the basic function that defines a lens. It's measured in millimeters, as you can see here, and that's what determines the field of view. So a shorter focal length, like 14 millimeter, will be super wide, or something, much higher, like 50 millimeter, is gonna be fairly zoomed in. Now, a lot of people when streaming want a really wide shot. For example, the Logitech Brio is a much wider field of view webcam. Your standard webcam is maybe about 72 degrees, whereas your Brio goes all the way out to 90 degrees for its field of view. If you wanted to achieve that field of view on a camera like, say, the Sony a6000, you would need a focal length of about 12 millimeters. Wide angle shots are really cool. It gives you a sense of your surrounding. It allows you to show off the area you're streaming in, giving the viewer kind of a more immersive context. They feel like they're in the room with you. But there is a draw to having a little bit more of a narrow field of view. Are you noticing, by the way, when I'm zooming in here, the background is getting blurrier? This is one of the things that happens with a higher, more zoomed in focal length. You get a more shallow depth of field. You get that really artistic blurred background. See, background not so blurry anymore. Now, there are two different ways to get that shallow depth of field look. The first one is, rather than having a wide angle lens, get something a little more zoomed in. Like, for example, this is a 25 millimeter lens on this Sony. That's gonna give you a tighter angle and it's gonna blur your background much more. And just to give you an idea, a 25 millimeter lens will give you about a 50-degree field of view. It looks something like this. But the other attribute that can give you a shallow depth of field is called the aperture on the lens. Inside the lens, there are tiny little fans that open and close. I guess they're called blades, not fans, but is the Aperture Laboratories logo from Portal starting to make a little more sense now? The indicator of how wide an aperture can get is indicated with a little F next to it, so you'll see, f2.8, f4. The lower that number is, the wider open it can get. The wider an aperture can open on a lens, the more shallow the depth of field is gonna be. Also, the wider that it opens up, the more light you're letting in on your lens, so if you're streaming in a dark room, you're gonna want a really wide aperture lens to make sure you're not getting dark graininess behind you, right? Just be prepared. If you're going for something a little more zoomed in like this, you're gonna have to set your camera a little bit further away. I actually had to pull my desk about 2 feet away from the wall in order just to set the camera far away enough for myself. Another important thing to note before we move on, if you are going the full 9 yards, maybe you've got a good job or something and you want to get yourself a fancy camera, most expensive cameras have what's called a full frame sensor. Can you see the difference in size of these little squares here? The sensor is like the digital film. It's what the image finally lands on, and naturally the larger the sensor, the more light you're gonna get. The more light you get, the better the image. You following me? But another side effect of having a larger sensor is the camera is naturally gonna give you a wider image because it's capturing a wider image. Those small sensors are called crop sensors. You're literally taking the image that the lens is giving you and you're cropping it in. So if you do decide to get a full frame camera, something like Sony's A7 lineup or Canon's new EOS R camera or their EOS RP, I don't know if that one works for streaming, I haven't tried it, but this is, for example, a full frame camera. Know that your image is about 1.6 times wider than it would look on a crop sensor camera. This can be really cool because this means you can zoom in more with your lens and still get the same field of view, allowing you to blur your background more efficiently. So when I recommended a 25mm on a crop sensor camera like this, I'm actually using a 40mm lens on my full frame. We're getting the same field of view. My camera's blurrier in the background. Does that make sense? By the way, that blurred effect on the background that we're talking about, it's called bokeh. So, you know, do what you want with that, impress your friends. Anyway, let me give you a heads up, okay? Not all lenses are created equal. If you get a cheap lens, your image will not look as good as a fancy lens. It might be blurrier, the colors might be a little less vibrant. The lens is in many cases just as important, if not more important than the camera itself. I kind of made that mistake with this 25mm right here. I got a $500 camera and a $85 lens, and I could not get this thing to focus. It's just a cheap, crappy lens. I shouldn't have done that. But there are ways to save a lot of money on lenses. Let me talk about what you need and what you don't need, okay? For example, something that is a necessity for filming, but something I turn off when I'm streaming is autofocus. You're sitting in one place while you're streaming. You don't need your camera to be continuously trying to focus and figure out where your face is. That's the problem that you see when streamers' faces will go out of focus for a second, then back in focus. It's a camera trying to focus on you. You don't need that. So if you can find a lens without autofocus, you're gonna save yourself a ton of money because there are no electronic motors inside that lens. Another great way to save a lot of money on a lens is getting a prime lens. Let me grab one for you. This is a prime lens, which means it has absolutely no zooming functions. It is 14mm and 14mm only. This is another wide angle lens. It is a 16 to 35mm. So it's not prime. 16, 35. This lens here is not prime. 24, 70. Back to 24. Getting a prime lens can save you a ton of money because again, you're eliminating a lot of moving parts from the inside of that lens. This is a 16 to 35mm lens with autofocus on it. This is a 14mm only lens with no autofocus. $300, $1,000. And surprisingly, this lens can actually get lower in aperture, so it can actually take in more light and get a more shallow depth of field. This looks way better for streaming than this does, and this costs more than 3 times the amount because all those unnecessary functions that you don't need for streaming are gone. I never use this for videography. I rarely use it for photography because you have to manually focus it every single time and it's a giant pain, but it's great for streaming. If you want my opinion on cameras, there are 2 that I would suggest. One, the Sony a5100. This is actually the Sony a6000, but there's really no difference in terms of image quality between this and the Sony a5100, and it's like $50 to $100 cheaper. So the Sony a5100 is a great choice. If you're looking for a Canon equivalent, the Canon SL2 is a great option also. I don't have that one. Really, the determining factor between these two is what lens you like the most and which camera does it fit on. If you find a Canon lens that you like more, get the SL2. If you find a Sony lens that you like more, get the a5100. If you're looking for a full frame camera, I just suggested the Sony a7 to a friend the other day. It is like, how much is that camera now? I think you can get it without a lens for like $800. And I know that sounds like a lot of money to a lot of you, but for a full frame mirrorless camera, that is incredibly cheap. Yeah, Sony a7, body only, $800. If you want it with a lens, you can get it for less than $1,000. That is nutty. But keep in mind that full frame lenses are also more expensive than crop sensor lenses. But after all this, you want to know the real way to find the perfect camera for your stream? Find the streamer that you think has the best looking camera and ask him what he uses. Then you don't have to go through the whole trial and error and the potential of buying a bad $300 lens and letting other people make mistakes for you and then learning from them is a 900 IQ play. But I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also feel free to come and check out my camera setup. I use a Canon 5D and an EOS R. It is a stupid camera setup. Probably not one that I recommend for streaming, but I make YouTube videos. I need fancy cameras. Anyway, then I just use them for streaming because I can. Links to everything, including equipment, in the description down below. And as always, happy streaming.
It's from Halo.
No, it's definitely not. That's Cortana.
She's chick with the boobs.
In Halo 4, she most definitely is.
You showed me her. Like, you've like shown me how her body changed each game. Am I making you uncomfortable?